She said it in front of 23 people. We were standing in the dining room of my parents' house. The formal one, with the cream wallpaper and the chandelier my mother had ordered from a catalogue in 2004 and never stopped talking about. It was my sister Becca's engagement party. There were 23 people in that room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, Becca's future in-laws who had driven 4 hours from Savannah, 2 of my mother's friends from church, and my father, who was standing closest to the door, like he always did when he sensed something was coming, and had already decided not to stop it. My sister looked at me across the table. Past the floral centerpiece, past the engraved champagne flutes, past the little printed menus my mother had made on cardstock, and she said, loudly enough for every one of those 23 people to hear her. Nobody invited you to have an opinion, Laurel. You're here because Mum felt sorry for you. That's the only reason you ever get included. Then she picked up her champagne flute and touched it gently to her fiancés and smiled, and the room exhaled slowly, and nobody said a word. My name is Laurel Voss. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how I spent 12 years being invisible in my own family, and how, on one Saturday afternoon in April, in front of 112 people, and a photographer, who later told me she'd never seen anything like it in 11 years of shooting, weddings, everything came into the light. The reversal has already happened. I want to make sure you understand it fully before I'm done. I've shared pieces of this with people who told me they recognized their own family in what I described. If that happens for you while you're listening, I'd be glad to hear about it, and it might be worth staying close to this channel, because I'm not the only one with a story like this. My parents' house sits on a corner lot in Dunmore, Georgia, a town of about 11,000 people. The kind of place where the Methodist Church has a bigger parking lot than the grocery store, and where people have long memories about whose family did what. In 1987, the house is brick, 2 stories, with a screened porch on the back, that my father built himself the summer I was 8. I remember the smell of cut lumber and the way the sawdust settled on everything, on the porch railing, on my father's forearms, on the iced tea my mother brought out to him without being asked. It was a good house. I want to say that clearly, because nothing I'm about to tell you is a story about poverty or neglect in the conventional sense. We were comfortable. My father, Gerald Voss, ran a small plumbing supply business that his own father had started in 1961. My mother, Patricia, taught 4th grade at Dunmore Elementary for 27 years. Before she retired, they were church-going, bill-paying, casserole-bringing people who believed in the appearance of a good family, which is not the same thing as the reality of one. There were 3 of us. Becca was the oldest, 37 now. Then me, Laurel, 3 years younger. Then our brother Mason, who is 29 and has lived in Portland, Oregon for the past 5 years, which I understand completely. The ranking in our family was never stated. It didn't need to be. You learn these things the way you learn, which floorboard creaks through daily, repetitive experience until avoidance becomes instinct. Becca was first. She had been first since before I have memories. She was the pretty one, the social one, the one who made my mother proud at church functions and whose report cards got displayed on the refrigerator, while mine went into a drawer. This is not bitterness speaking. This is arithmetic. I kept both once, when I was 12. Hers was on the refrigerator for 41 days. Mine was in the second drawer from the bottom for a total of 6 hours, before it was moved to make room for a takeout menu. Becca had my mother's cheekbones and my father's confidence, and she understood early that the world would be arranged around her comfort if she simply expected it to be. She had brown hair that she highlighted every 6 weeks at a salon in Augusta, and a laugh that carried across rooms in a way people described as musical, even when what she was laughing at was cruel. I was different. I was the one who read too much, who asked questions at the wrong times, who wanted to talk about things my family found uncomfortable. I got my father's jaw and my mother's hair, which is to say, I got the less photogenic versions of both, and I had a habit of saying what I actually thought that my mother described. Throughout my childhood, as Laurel's way of making things difficult, Mason came along when I was 5, and for a few years I hoped we would be allies. We were, sometimes. in the way that hostages in the same cell are allies. We understood each other's situation without having to explain it, but Mason's strategy was disappearance. He became quiet, agreeable, and eventually absent. I don't blame him. It was a reasonable survival choice. Mine was different. I stayed. I tried. For 34 years, I kept trying to be seen clearly by people who had already decided what I was. That was my longest mistake. The house had a smell in the mornings. Coffee and something floral from my mother's dish soap, and in the winter a faint trace of the cedar balls she kept in the hall closet. I can describe it precisely because I stood in that hallway for a very long time, listening to conversations I was not invited into, understanding things I was not meant to understand. There was one thing I understood sooner than anyone thought I did. BECCA didn't just outrank me in the family hierarchy. She actively maintained that hierarchy. She was not careless about her position. She worked at it, and the people around her let her because it was easier to let BECCA have what she wanted than to manage what happened when she didn't. That, I would come to understand, was the load-bearing fact of our entire family structure. I want to take you through specific moments, because I think specificity is the only honest way to tell a story like this. Anyone can say my sister was cruel to me. What I want you to understand is what it actually looked like, in rooms and with specific words, over the course of years. The first moment I want to tell you about happened in March. 11 years ago, when I was 23, I had just finished my accounting degree at the University of Georgia and taken a job at a mid-sized firm in Atlanta called Hargrove Financial Group. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had applied and interviewed and accepted the offer, without telling anyone in my family, partly because I wanted to be able to say I'd done it myself, and partly because I already knew what the conversation would look like if I didn't. The night I announced it at dinner, we were sitting around the table in the kitchen, the informal one, with the yellow tile my mother had never liked but never replaced. My mother had made her chicken casserole, the one with the cream of mushroom soup and the crumbled crackers on top, and the kitchen smelled of it, warm and dense. I waited until there was a natural pause in the conversation. BECCA had been talking about a promotion she was being considered for at the marketing firm where she worked, and then I said I had news. I told them about the job. I said the starting salary was $52,000 and that I would be moving to Atlanta in 3 weeks. My mother said, Atlanta. My father said nothing and looked at his plate. And BECCA said, an accounting firm. So, basically, you'll be the person who does other people's math for them. She said it pleasantly, the way you might comment on the weather. Then she turned back to her mother and said, anyway, about the promotion. Terry says the decision will be made by April. The conversation moved on. I ate my casserole. I didn't say anything, but I felt something harden in my chest right then. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that produced tears or outbursts. Just a small, quiet solidification, the way water becomes ice, slow and complete and permanent. That was the first time I understood that my accomplishments would only ever be acknowledged in the space that was left over after BECCA was finished. And I want to be precise. That space was very small, and it was shrinking. The second moment happened 2 years later, at Thanksgiving. I was 25. I had been promoted at Hargrove Financial Group and was managing 3 junior accounts on my own. I had a small apartment in the Virginia Highland neighborhood of Atlanta, with hardwood floors and a kitchen window that looked out onto a courtyard where someone had planted rosemary in terracotta pots. I was, by any reasonable measure, building something real. I came home for Thanksgiving because my mother called 3 times in the same week to say she hoped I would make the effort, and because I was 25 and still believed that making the effort might eventually amount to something. There were 14 people at the table that year. My parents, BECCA and her then boyfriend Derek, Mason, who was still living at home at the time and had that hunted look he carried through his mid-20s, 2 aunts, and an uncle, a couple my parents knew from church, and 3 cousins ranging in age from 9 to 19. My mother had asked everyone to say something they were grateful for. This is a tradition she enforced with the seriousness of a legal proceeding. When it came to me, I said I was grateful for my apartment and for the people I worked with, and that I was proud of what I'd built in the past 2 years. Becca, who went after me, said, "I'm grateful I've never had to be proud of something just to survive it." She smiled when she said it. 3 people laughed softly, though I'm not sure they understood exactly what they were laughing at. My mother moved the conversation along. My father served himself more turkey. I looked at the centerpiece, a wicker cornucopia with fake gourds spilling out of it, and I thought about the rosemary and terracotta pots outside my kitchen window, and I decided, quietly, that I would leave after dessert and not after dinner, the way I'd planned. I did. I drove 2 hours back to Atlanta in the dark, listening to a radio station playing old country music, and I felt something that I would later recognize as clarity. Not comfort. Clarity. What I hadn't yet decided was what to do with it. The third moment happened 3 years after that, when I was 28, and it was the one that introduced money into the equation in a way I couldn't ignore. My grandmother on my mother's side, Lorraine Whitfield, who had lived in a small house in Macon for 30 years, and made the best cornbread I have ever eaten, and who smelled of lavender talc and always called me her sensible one, passed away in February after a short illness. She was 81. She had been careful with money her entire life, the way people who grew up poor in the South sometimes are, not paranoid, just precise. She kept receipts. She paid cash when she could. She owned her house outright. When the estate was settled, Grandma Lorraine left her assets divided among her 4 grandchildren: Becca, me, Mason, and our cousin Darla, who lived in Florida and whom we saw at Christmas every 3 or 4 years. The attorney, a soft-spoken man named Howard Pitts, called us each individually. He told me my share was $31,000. I thanked him and hung up. Later that week, at a family dinner at my parents' house, the formal dining room, the chandelier, the cream wallpaper, my mother mentioned that Becca was thinking of using her inheritance to put a down payment on a condo. I said that sounded reasonable. My mother said, "Well, she got a little more than you and Mason. Your grandmother loved all of you equally, of course, but she wanted to give Becca a boost because Becca has real potential to build something substantial." I said, "How much more?" My mother hesitated. Then she said, $50,000. I sat with that number for a moment. Becca had received $81,000 from our grandmother's estate. I had received $31,000. Mason, I found out later, had received $29,000. Darla had received $30,000. The difference was $50,000, moved quietly from 3 shares to 1, rationalized with the phrase, "real potential," and delivered to me as a footnote after the fact. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "I see," and I helped clear the dishes. But that number, $50,000, settled into me the way a stone settles into still water. It sank. It stayed. I would come back to it later, much later, with documentation. The fourth moment was smaller in scale and larger in effect, and it happened at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon in June, 2 years before the wedding. I had driven up from Atlanta, a 2-hour drive, door to door, because my mother had called to say she needed help reorganizing the attic before the summer got too hot. I spent 4 hours in that attic, in heat that hovered around 93 degrees according to the small thermometer mounted near the pull-down stairs, moving boxes and labeling them, and carrying armloads of old clothes down to the car for donation. Becca arrived at 3 in the afternoon with iced coffees from a drive-thru, 2 of them, one for herself and one for my mother. She sat at the kitchen table while my mother and I unloaded the last of the donation bags. When we came inside, my mother said to Becca, "You have no idea how much we got done today. Becca, you should have seen the state of that attic." Becca looked at me and said, "You could have hired someone to do that, Laurel, unless you actually enjoy that kind of thing." She sipped her iced coffee. My mother laughed. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink. The dish soap smelled of green apple. I dried them on a paper towel and thought about the drive home, about the rosemary in the courtyard, about what I was going to make for dinner. I said nothing, but I had begun, sometime in the previous weeks, to write things down. Not in an emotional way, not a diary. A log, dates, times, specific words, specific incidents, the kind of document you build when you are an accountant by training, and you have begun to understand that what you're dealing with is not a feeling. It is a pattern, and patterns can be documented. I had kept that log for 6 weeks when the worst thing happened. Not the worst thing BECCA ever said to me. That you already know. But the incident that made me understand I was not simply dealing with a difficult sister and an inattentive family. I was dealing with something deliberate, something that had extended beyond careless cruelty into something that had a shape and a direction and a specific financial target. I need to take you back 6 months before the engagement party, because that's when I found the email. I found it by accident, which is the only honest way to describe it. I was 33. It was October, a Thursday evening, and I was at my parents' house for a long weekend because my mother had had a minor knee surgery and I had taken Friday off to help. My father was managing his business. BECCA had sent flowers from a florist in Augusta and called twice, both calls lasting under 4 minutes, which I know because I was there for both of them, and I have always had a precise sense of time. I was using my parents' desktop computer in the small room off the hallway that my father called his study, a room that smelled of old magazines and the particular staleness of a space that is used for storage more than thinking. Because my laptop battery had died and I needed to print a document for work. My mother was logged into her email. I wasn't looking at it. I was waiting for my document to print. But the screen was open and the subject line was visible, and the subject line said, the revised plan for the trust. I want to be precise about what I did next. I did not snoop. I did not read through my mother's inbox. I saw that one email open on the screen, and I read it because the word trust had appeared in a family communication, and no one had mentioned any trust to me, and I am an accountant, and I understand what trusts are. The email was from BECCA to my mother. It was dated 3 weeks earlier. I am going to tell you exactly what it said, because the specifics matter. BECCA had written, "Mom, I talked to Uncle Ray and he thinks the simplest approach is to restructure Dad's business trust so that the primary beneficiary designation routes the liquid assets to me as the named executor. That way there's no ambiguity when the time comes and we don't have to deal with the Laurel situation. She'll still get something. I'm not saying exclude her entirely, but if we're being practical about who is actually going to manage the family's financial future, it should be someone who is here and invested. You know that's true. This is just making it official." My mother had replied, "You're right, sweetheart. I'll talk to your father this weekend. Let's not mention it to Laurel yet." I sat in front of that screen for 90 seconds. I know it was 90 seconds because the printer finished. During that time, it takes approximately 90 seconds to print a 4-page document on that machine, and the sound of it pulling paper through the mechanism was the only noise in the room. Then I closed the email, collected my document, and went to help my mother with dinner. I made her soup from a can and cut the toast into triangles the way she'd always done for us when we were sick. I sat with her while she ate. I said the soup was good. She said it was nice to have me home. I drove back to Atlanta the next morning. I stopped at a gas station outside of town and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. Then I called the one person who had always believed me without requiring proof. Her name is Diane Kovacs, and she is my best friend from college. We met sophomore year over a shared copy of an intermediate accounting textbook and have been close ever since. She lives in Decatur now, 20 minutes from my apartment, and she works as a paralegal at a firm that specializes in estate and family law. I told her what I had seen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Laurel, I need you to tell me exactly what the email said, word for word if you can." I told her word for word. I have a precise memory for language, especially language that matters. She said, "Okay, don't do anything yet. Let me make a call." Her call led to an appointment. 2 weeks later, with an estate attorney named Martin Cleary, whose office was in a building in Buckhead, with a view of the highway and walls lined with the kind of law books that are decorative, but also real. He wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and had a handshake like a person who understood gravity. I brought everything I had. The log I had been keeping for 8 months. A printout of the email. I had photographed it with my phone before leaving the room, which was an instinct I can only attribute to the part of my brain that had already been building a case for a long time without fully announcing itself. I had a copy of Grandma Lorraine's estate distribution, which Howard Pitts had sent me, in writing, following our phone call. I had bank statements showing $31,000 deposited in February, 2 years prior. I had the original will, which I had requested a copy of from the probate court in Macon, for a $15 processing fee. Martin Cleary put on his reading glasses and went through everything slowly. Then he said, "The email itself doesn't constitute legal action. But what it describes, restructuring a business trust to redirect assets based on undisclosed family agreement, without the knowledge of existing potential beneficiaries. That, the conversation we need to take seriously." He asked me about my father's business. I told him what I knew. Voss Plumbing Supply had been operating since 1961, had 3 employees, and my father had taken out a small business loan in 2018 that he'd largely repaid. I did not know the current assessed value of the business, or the structure of the existing trust. Martin said, "There are ways to find out." Over the next 6 weeks, we found out. Martin filed a formal request for disclosure of the business trust documentation under Georgia estate law, which my father's attorney, a general practice lawyer named Paul Emery, who had handled the Voss family's legal matters for 20 years, and who, I suspect, had not anticipated being formally contacted by an estate litigation specialist, was required to provide. The documents arrived on a Tuesday morning in December. My father's business trust, as it stood, named BECCA as sole executor and primary beneficiary of the liquid assets, which at current valuation totaled $187,000. The modification had been made 14 months earlier, 8 months before I found the email, which meant the email had been confirming something already in motion, not initiating it. My share as of the modification: a personal property distribution of household items to be divided equally among surviving children, and a cash allocation of $15,000. Becca's share: $187,000 in liquid business assets, plus sole executorship. Mason's share: $15,000, same as mine, which told me he also did not know. Martin set down the documents. He took off his reading glasses. He said, "Do you want to challenge the modification?" I thought about it for exactly 1 meeting. Then I said, "Not yet. Tell me what else I'm entitled to know." What I was entitled to know, as it turned out, was considerable, because 14 months is a very specific window of time. And 14 months before the trust modification, a very specific thing had happened. My grandmother had died and left her estate to her grandchildren. And the distribution of that estate, in which BECCA had received $50,000 more than any other grandchild, had been directed, according to the probate documents from Macon, by a letter of instruction submitted by my mother on behalf of Grandma Lorraine. My grandmother had not written that letter. I know this because I have my grandmother's handwriting on 43 birthday and Christmas cards spanning my entire childhood, and I brought 6 of them to a forensic document examiner named Carol Sievert, who charges $350 per hour and has testified in 11 Georgia court cases. And she told me, after 2 appointments and a written report, that the letter of instruction on file at the Bibb County Probate Court was, in her professional opinion, not consistent with the handwriting samples provided. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked Martin Carey what the legal term was for submitting a fraudulent letter of instruction to a probate court. He told me. Then he told me what the potential consequences were. I said, "I understand. I want to be careful about how this moves forward. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive person. I did not assemble this information because I wanted to destroy my family. I assembled it because I am an accountant, and I had been handed numbers that did not add up. And in my professional experience, numbers that do not add up are always telling you something. What these numbers were telling me was that for at least 14 months, and possibly longer, the people who were supposed to be my family had been quietly engineering my financial irrelevance. And they had done it while inviting me to engagement parties and asking me to reorganize attics in 93-degree heat. There was one more thing I needed to confirm before I decided what to do, and it came from a source I had not expected. Mason called me in January. He called on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. Mason and I spoke regularly, but usually on weekends, usually initiated by me. This time he called at 7:15 on a Tuesday, and when I picked up he said, "Laurel, I need to tell you something and I need you to not react to it while I'm talking." I said, "Okay." He said that 2 weeks earlier, at Christmas, he had overheard a conversation between BECCA and our mother in the kitchen while he was coming down the stairs. He said BECCA had been talking about the wedding. The wedding was in April, 4 months away by then, and about the seating arrangements, and that she had said, specifically, "I don't want Laurel anywhere near the head table or the family photos. I know she has to be invited because Mom will make a scene, but I want it to be clear that she's not part of the inner circle at this wedding. She can sit with the cousins." He said our mother had responded, "Of course, sweetheart, whatever you want." Mason said, "I've been thinking about whether to tell you for 2 weeks." I said, "I'm glad you did." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to go to the wedding." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Laurel, what have you been doing?" I told him, "Not everything. Not yet, but enough." I told him about the trust modification, about the grandmother's estate, about Martin Cleary. I told him about his own $15,000 allocation. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I counted 8 seconds. Then he said, "Tell me what you need from me." What I needed from Mason was a witness and a memory. He had overheard conversations I hadn't. He remembered a specific exchange from 3 years earlier, at Thanksgiving, in which BECCA had explicitly told our mother that she should start moving things in the right direction before it becomes a legal issue, a statement that had meant nothing to him at the time and meant everything now. He was willing to write it down. He did, in a signed and dated statement that I kept in the same folder as the forensic document examiner's report and Martin Cleary's correspondence. I want to stop here and explain something about how I was feeling during this period, because I think it matters. I was not angry, or rather, I had already been angry years earlier, in smaller and more manageable increments. By the time I was assembling this documentation, what I felt was not anger. It was something closer to the feeling of completing a difficult audit, a kind of focused, methodical clarity that pushes everything emotional to the side because the task at hand requires precision. I had 12 years of being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that I was peripheral, that I was included by obligation, that my presence at family events was a courtesy extended to me by people who found me inconvenient. I had decided, quietly and without drama, that I was not going to argue with that narrative. I was going to replace it. Martin Cleary and I had a final meeting in February. We discussed options. A full legal challenge to the trust modification was possible, but would be lengthy, expensive. He estimated $30,000 to $50,000 in legal fees, and emotionally costly. Ways I had already begun to calculate. There was another option, Martin said. You have the forensic report, you have the probate discrepancy, you have documented financial irregularity. If you want to use this as leverage rather than litigation, you need to choose the right moment. I said. I already know the moment. He looked at me. I said April 14th. The wedding was held at a venue called Whitfield Garden, 40 minutes outside of Dunmore, a restored antebellum property that had been converted into an event space and that charged $8,500 for weekend rental. There were 112 guests. The flowers were white peonies and something called Dusty Miller, which I know because the florist's invoice was among the wedding planning documents BECCA had stored in a shared family Google Drive that she had invited me to view, a gesture of apparent inclusion that was actually, I think, about making sure I could see how much was being spent, so that I could appreciate the scale of something I was not truly part of. I was seated, as Mason had predicted, at table 11, the cousins' table. I was between a 17-year-old named Tyler, who spent the cocktail hour on his phone, and an older cousin named Patrice, who asked me twice if I was still doing the accounting thing, and seemed mildly surprised that I was. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. Becca wore a dress that had cost $4,200 and looked it. She was genuinely beautiful. I want to say that. She has always been genuinely beautiful, and I have never envied that specifically. What I envied was the way beauty, in her case, came packaged with the assumption that the world owed her accommodation, and the fact that the world had repeatedly agreed. The ceremony was officiated by a pastor from the Dunmore Methodist Church, and there was a reading from Corinthians that everyone always uses, and a second reading from Rumi that surprised me. The groom, his name is Trevor Alderman. He works in commercial real estate. He is 39 years old, and he seemed, in my limited observation, like a man who loves Becca and does not yet know what he loves. Cried during the vows in a way. That was real. I sat in the third row, because family was in the first 3 rows, and my mother had insisted on that much. And I held my program, cream cardstock, printed in a font called Garamond, and I thought about what I was going to do. I had the voicemail on my phone. The voicemail was from Becca. She had left it for me 3 weeks earlier on a Thursday evening at 9:47, during a period when I think she had been drinking. I don't say that to diminish what she said, but because it explains why she said it on a recorded line rather than in person, which was unlike her. Becca was usually careful. She had not been careful that Thursday. She had left a 2-minute and 17-second voicemail in which she said, among other things, "I need you to understand something, Laurel. The wedding is mine. The family is mine. You've been hanging around the edges of this family your whole life, thinking that showing up is enough. But nobody actually wants you there. Mom invites you because she feels guilty. Dad doesn't say anything because he never says anything. But I'm telling you now, as clearly as I know how. After this wedding, I would really prefer if you just, I don't know, found your own life somewhere. Because you are exhausting, and none of us want to keep managing your feelings about where you fit." Then she had said, "I hope you find something that makes you happy. I really do. Just somewhere else." I had listened to it 4 times. Then I had sent a copy to Martin Cleary, and another copy to my personal cloud storage account, and a third copy to Diane Kovacs with a message that said, "Keep this safe." Then I had called Becca back and told her I would be at the wedding and that I was looking forward to celebrating with her. She had said, "Great, see you there." The reception began at 6 o'clock. There were round tables with white linens and mason jar centerpieces with candles inside them. And the venue smelled of the peonies and of the warm evening air coming through the open terrace doors, and faintly, of whatever cleaning product they'd used on the hardwood floors. A band was set up on the far end of the room. A 4-piece that played the kind of covers that work at weddings. Competent and pleasant and forgettable. At 7:15, the best man gave a toast. He was Trevor's college roommate, and he was clearly nervous, and his toast was fine, warm, slightly too long. The kind of toast that gets a generous laugh, because everyone is rooting for the speaker. People clinked glasses. Then Becca's maid of honor went. Her name is Candace, whom I have known since they were in 7th grade together. And Candace cried twice during her toast, and said Becca was the most loyal friend she had ever had. And I sat at table 11 and kept my face still. Then there was a pause, and the band leader asked if anyone else would like to say a few words before the couple had their first dance. I stood up. I want to describe this exactly. I stood up slowly, the way you stand when you have decided something. I did not scrape my chair. I did not wave my hand to get attention. I simply stood, and the room's ambient noise dropped by about half, because I was not the expected person to be standing. And people notice unexpected things. My mother looked at me from the head table with an expression I can only describe as the look of someone who has just heard a sound they cannot immediately identify. Becca looked at me. She had Trevor's hand in hers, and she did not release it. I said, "Hi, for those who don't know me. I'm Laurel, Becca's sister." I said it calmly, not pointedly, just as a fact. I said, "I've been thinking about what I wanted to say today. I thought about being brief, but I think the people in this room deserve to understand something real about this family, because most of you are joining it today, and I think you should know what you're joining." The room was quiet now. 112 people, a band that had stopped tuning. a photographer named Jamie Serrano, who later told me she had not moved from her position near the terrace door for the entirety of what followed. I said, 3 weeks ago, my sister left me a voicemail. I'd like to play it for you. Becca's hand tightened on Trevor's. I saw it from 20 feet away. I took my phone out of the inside pocket of my dress jacket. I had worn a dress with a jacket specifically because I needed a pocket that held a phone. And I pressed play, and I held it up, and the room was quiet enough that every word was audible. The voicemail played in full. 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Nobody moved. I have thought about those 4 minutes many times since. The 2 minutes and 17 seconds of the voicemail, and then the approximately 90 seconds of silence that followed before anyone spoke. I've thought about what it must have looked and sounded like from the outside. 112 people, in a room that smelled of peonies and candle wax, and a voice from a phone speaker saying nobody actually wants you there and just find your own life somewhere else, and I hope you find something that makes you happy. Just somewhere else. I've thought about Trevor Alderman, who sat next to his new wife with his jaw set and his eyes moving between me and Becca and back to me in a way that told me everything I needed to know about what he had and had not been told. When the voicemail ended, I put the phone back in my pocket. I said, "That's one thing." I said, "The second thing is this." I had brought a document. Martin Cleary had prepared it. A 2-page summary, printed on plain paper, that outlined the facts, the trust modification, the $187,000 beneficiary designation, the $31,000 inheritance versus $81,000, the letter of instruction discrepancy, the forensic examiner's finding, no legal claims. Martin had been clear that this was not the venue for legal claims, just facts. Documented, sourced, referenced facts, with dates and dollar amounts and the names of the professionals who had reviewed them. I had printed 100 copies. They were in a box in my car, which was parked outside. I did not hand them out at the reception. That had never been my intention. What I did was read 3 sentences from the document. Slowly, in the same calm voice I had been using since I stood up, I said, "My father's business trust was modified 14 months ago. As of that modification, Becca is named primary beneficiary of $187,000 in liquid assets. My allocation is $15,000. Mason's is the same. I found this out not because I was told, but because I asked a lawyer." I said, "I'm not here to make accusations at a wedding. I'm here because I was told I was only included because my mother felt sorry for me. And I think the people in this room, especially the people who are becoming part of this family today, should understand that this family has some paperwork that doesn't match what it says out loud." I looked at Trevor Alderman when I said that, not at Becca, at Trevor. He held my gaze. I said, "Congratulations, Trevor. I mean that. I hope you and Becca are very happy." Then I said, "I'm going to step outside now." I picked up my clutch from table 11. I walked to the terrace doors. I pushed them open. The April evening smelled of grass and distant wood smoke. Behind me, I heard Becca say, and this is the exact sentence, the one that comes back to me most clearly when I think about that evening. I heard Trevor say quietly, just her name, nothing else. I walked outside into the April air and I sat on a low stone wall near the garden and I looked at the sky, which had gone that particular shade of blue that comes just after sunset and just before full dark. And I breathed. Diane was already there. She'd been waiting outside by arrangement since 6:30. She sat next to me on the wall and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like I'm 34 years old and I am done." She put her arm around me, and we stayed there while the sounds of the reception continued. Inside, the band, starting up, the murmur of voices, the occasional clinking glass. I was done, and it turned out that being done was the beginning of something, rather than the end. I need to tell you what happened inside the room while I was sitting on that wall, because I know it through witnesses who have told me independently, and whose accounts agree in every detail that matters. Trevor pulled Becca outside within 10 minutes of my departure. They were out there for 35 minutes. I don't know everything they said, but Diane and I were sitting close enough to hear the shape of it. Not words, but BECCA. And the register of Trevor's voice was steady and low in a way that is more serious than raised. Becca's voice went up twice. Then it went quiet. Inside, my mother sat at the head table without moving for most of that 35 minutes. My father, who had been standing near the bar, walked to her table and sat next to her, and put his hand on hers. That's the detail that got me later. Not my mother's stillness, but my father's hand. He doesn't do that. In 34 years, I have not often seen my father comfort my mother. That he did it right then told me something had shifted for him in a way that words would have taken much longer to accomplish. My Uncle Raymond, my mother's brother, the one referenced in Becca's email, the one who had apparently been consulted about the trust restructuring, left the reception at 8:30. I was told he did not say goodbye to anyone. His wife stayed another hour, during which time she spoke to my mother privately for approximately 15 minutes. I have not been told what was said and I have not asked. Mason found me outside at 9 o'clock. He sat on the wall next to Diane and he said, "I want you to know I'm proud of you." I said, "You came." He had driven from Portland for the wedding and had been at table 11 beside me all evening, and he had not known what I was going to do. I had only told him that I was going to say something, that it was going to be honest, and that he should stay in his seat and not intervene, which he had done with the composure of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing to become visible. At 10:15, a woman I didn't recognize came outside and asked if I was Laurel Voss. I said yes. She introduced herself as Clara Alderman, Trevor's mother. She was a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair pinned back, and the kind of posture that comes from being told to stand up straight for long enough that it becomes permanent. She said, "I want to apologize for not knowing sooner what kind of family my son was marrying into." I said, "That's not your apology to make." She said, "No, but I wanted to make it anyway." She went back inside. I watched her go. That was the moment. Not the voicemail. Not the room full of people. Not Trevor's steady voice in the garden. That made me cry quietly. Briefly, the way I always do the important things. Just sitting on a stone wall in the dark with Diane's hand on my arm, and the smell of April grass and the sound of a wedding band playing. Something slow and sweet inside. I cried for about 90 seconds. Then I stopped. The 100 copies of the document in my car were not for the reception. They were for the meeting I had requested with my parents, which took place 11 days after the wedding in their dining room, with Martin Thierry present and with Mason on speakerphone from Portland. I gave my parents each a copy. My father read it without speaking. He read it slowly, page by page, and when he finished he set it down on the table and looked at it for a while. Then he looked at me. He said, "Laurel, I didn't know about all of this." I believed him about some of it, not all of it. I think my father has always operated on a principle of strategic unawareness, choosing not to know things that would require him to act. But I believed he hadn't known about the letter of instruction. That one had genuinely surprised him. His face, when Martin Thierry explained what the forensic examiner had found, did something I had not seen my father's face do in a very long time. It looked uncertain, not guilty, uncertain, like a man who is revising a story he thought he knew. My mother did not read the document in the meeting. She held it and looked at the first page and then set it face down on the table and kept her hand on top of it. She said, "I want you to know that everything I did was for this family." I said, "I know you believe that." She said, "Laurel, your grandmother wanted BECCA too." Martin Cleary said, gently, "Asterisk, Mistress Voss, I'd recommend not discussing the probate letter in this context." She stopped. There was a silence. Outside in the mine in the backyard, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. 3 sharp barks. Then quiet. I said, "I'm not here to start a legal process. Mom, that's not what I want. What I want is for this family to operate honestly from now on. I want the trust amended to reflect an equitable distribution. I want an acknowledgement of what happened with Grandma Lorraine's estate. And I want us to have a conversation, eventually, about what has actually been going on in this family for 34 years. I'm willing to have all 3 of those conversations. I'm not willing to continue pretending none of it happened. My father said, the trust can be amended. He said it simply, the way he might say he needed to replace a pipe fitting. Just a fact, just a correction that needed to be made. My mother didn't speak for a long time after that. The trust was amended 43 days after the meeting. Martin Cleary oversaw the amendment. The revised document distributes the business assets equally among the 3 surviving children, BECCA, me, and Mason. The executorship was changed to a co-executorship, shared between all 3. The probate matter from Grandma Lorraine's estate is more complicated. Martin has filed a formal inquiry with the Bibb County Probate Court regarding the letter of instruction. That process is ongoing. I don't know how it will conclude. I have told Martin that my priority is documentation, not prosecution. I want the record to be accurate. Whatever form that takes. Becca and Trevor are still married. As of the time I'm telling you this, I don't know what their marriage looks like from the inside. Trevor called me once, 6 weeks after the wedding. He said, I want you to know I didn't marry her to hurt you. I said, I know. I hope you'll be good to each other. He said, I hope you'll come to Christmas. I said I would think about it. I have not yet spoken to Becca directly since the wedding. She sent me a text message 2 weeks after. It said, what you did at my wedding was unforgivable. I want you to know that. I read it once and did not respond. I have thought since then about what I might eventually say to her. Not to get something from her, but because she is my sister, and that is a fact that doesn't go away no matter what surrounds it. I don't know yet what a relationship with Becca looks like, or whether one is possible, or whether wanting one is something I owe myself, or something I owe her, or something I owe no one. I'm leaving that question open. I've learned to be careful about closing questions prematurely. My Uncle Raymond sent my father a letter. I don't know what was in it. My father has not discussed it with me, and I have not asked. Some things are theirs to work out. Mason came home for the 4th of July. We sat on the screened porch my father built. The summer I was 8 and ate watermelon and talked about Portland and about his job and about a woman he'd been seeing for 4 months whom he seemed genuinely happy about. At one point my mother came outside and sat in the 3rd chair, and we all talked about nothing consequential for an hour. And the evening smelled of charcoal from the neighbor, his grill, and of the particular green smell of summer in Georgia. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was present. And presence is something. My father has not apologized in words. He apologized by sitting down with Martin Cleary and signing the trust amendment without argument. Some apologies are structural rather than verbal, and I've learned to recognize the difference. My mother apologized once, briefly, on the phone in August. She said, I handled some things wrong. I know that. I said, thank you for saying that. She said, I do love you, Laurel. I want you to know that. I said, I know you do. And I meant it. That's the complicated part. The part that takes the longest to explain and that I suspect will take the longest to fully understand. My mother's love for me was real. It was also insufficient. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I have stopped trying to make them cancel each other out. I am telling you this story in the present tense now, because that's where it lives. I live in my apartment in Atlanta. The rosemary in the courtyard terracotta pots is still there. Different rosemary now. Replanted twice since I first moved in, but the same pots, the same window, the same view that I have found consistently reliable in its smallness and its permanence. I work at Hargrove Financial Group, where I am now a senior manager, overseeing a team of 7 people. I got there through work and through staying and through never once being able to tell myself that my position was handed to me by someone who loved me more than they loved my sister. I lost time. 12 years of it. Roughly 12 years of attending family functions in the role of peripheral character, of reorganizing attics in 93-degree heat, of eating Thanksgiving dinners where my accomplishments were treated as minor interruptions to the main event. I don't want those years back. You can't want time back productively. But I acknowledge them. What I gained is harder to name cleanly. I gained clarity, which sounds like a consolation prize but is actually quite difficult to come by. And once you have it, you understand why. I gained a relationship with Mason that is honest in a way it's never quite was when we were children, sharing the same disadvantaged position without the language for it. I gained the experience of having stood up in a room of 112 people and said something true, and then walked outside into the April air and found that the world was still there, still smelled of grass and wood smoke, still went on. I gained the understanding that composure is not the same as passivity, that documentation is not the same as revenge, that the opposite of being overlooked is not making noise, it's making things clear. What I now understand at 34 is this. The most dangerous thing you can do to a person is make them believe for a long time that they are peripheral. Not because it might make them angry, anger passes, because it might make them believe it. I came very close to believing it. I think that's the part of the story that keeps me honest about all of it. If something in this stayed with you, if you recognized a room, a table, a face, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts. And if you want to hear more stories told this way, you know where to find me. The opposite of being peripheral is being precise. Precise about what happened, precise about what it cost, precise about who you are when the room goes quiet and everyone is waiting to see what you'll do next. I am Laurel Voss. I am 34 years old, and I know exactly where I stand.